Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? In the dry heart of the Arizona Territory, the sun rose each day like a hammer over the anvil of the desert. Dust curled through the narrow streets of Dry Creek, a town where men gambled with both cards and fate, where dreams often turned to dust faster than the whiskey in a man's glass. Among these dreamers was Elias Carter, a quiet ranch hand who had worked the hard soil for years without much to show for it, except calloused hands and a heart full of wanting. The West had a way of testing a man's hope. For Elias, that hope came in the form of a small piece of parchment, a ticket for the town's annual lottery. Every year the richest man in Dry Creek, Colonel Whitmore, held the great frontier lottery, promising gold, land, or livestock to the winner. It was meant to be a spectacle, a distraction from the relentless sun and the endless work. Elias bought a ticket with the last dollar he had, whispering a silent prayer to whatever gods might listen out on the plains. The day of the drawing came with fanfare. The townsfolk gathered around the stage built outside Whitmore's grand saloon, its red curtains billowing in the hot wind. The colonel stood tall, his white suit shining like bone under the sun, holding the fate of 100 dreamers in his hands. Elias stood in the crowd, his hat pulled low, heart pounding as the numbers were called. Then, against all odds, his number was drawn. The crowd gasped, cheered, and some cursed under their breath. Elias, the quiet, poor ranch hand, had won. For the first time in years, his heart felt light. He imagined a small ranch of his own, maybe a horse or two, and a warm meal that didn't taste of dust and beans. But what came next would change everything. When Elias stepped up to claim his prize, the colonel smiled, but it wasn't the smile of generosity, it was the smile of a man amused by another's confusion. From the shadows behind the stage, 2 men dragged forward a young woman, her wrists bound, her eyes dark and fierce. Her clothes were torn from travel, her long black hair tangled with dust. She looked neither frightened nor submissive. She looked defiant. The colonel announced that this year's special prize was not gold or land, but a possession taken from Apache territory, a woman captured in a border raid. The crowd's cheers turned to murmurs. Some laughed, others looked away in shame. Elias stood frozen. He had thought he'd won freedom, not ownership of another human being. But the law in Dry Creek had long since rotted under the weight of greed. The colonel declared the prize final. Papers were signed, and the woman, silent, proud, burning with quiet fury, was handed over to Elias, as though she were a parcel, not a person. That night Elias sat alone on the porch of his rented shack, the desert wind whispering through the dry grass. Inside, the woman sat by the corner, motionless. Her eyes followed him with silent judgment. Elias did not speak. He did not know what to say, nor did he know what to do. The West had given him a cruel reward, and he could feel its weight pressing down like iron. In the days that followed, rumors spread fast through Dry Creek. They said Elias had been cursed, that no man could keep something taken from the Apache and live in peace. Men whispered that he should sell her, or send her away before her people came for revenge. But Elias did none of those things. He worked his land in silence, while she stayed distant, untouchable, watching everything with the quiet patience of a hawk. Sometimes, in the early dawn, he'd see her standing outside, staring east, toward the distant mountains where her people once roamed. There was pain in her stance, but also strength, a spirit that refused to be broken by chains or fate. And something in Elias began to shift. The gold he once dreamed of no longer mattered. The land, the winnings, all felt hollow beside the weight of what he'd been given. As the weeks passed, the town began to turn against him. Men who once nodded now spat in the dust near his boots. Some claimed he was harboring danger, that the Apache woman would bring ruin upon them all. But Elias had begun to see her differently. Not as a prize, but as a person carrying a world of sorrow and pride within her. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he saw her kneeling by the dry riverbed, her hands pressed into the earth as if listening to something beneath it. The sight struck him like a revelation, that perhaps she was praying or remembering. In that quiet, Elias felt an ache he could not name. The desert around them was vast, merciless, but in that stillness there was also a strange sense of destiny. What began as a cruel twist of fortune was slowly becoming something else, something that neither he nor the town could yet understand. And as the moon rose over Dry Creek, a whisper rode the wind from the distant mesas, word that Apache warriors had been seen on the horizon. Something was coming, and Elias knew his so-called prize might soon cost him far more than gold ever could. The wind over Dry Creek carried whispers of trouble. Riders from the north spoke of Apache movement in the hills, silent figures seen at twilight, watching from afar. To most townsfolk it meant danger. To Elias Carter it meant something deeper, a reckoning drawing closer each day. The woman he had unwillingly won, silent and strong, was no mere possession. She was the reason those shadows gathered at the edge of the horizon. Days bled into one another beneath a merciless sun. Elias continued tending his land, though the soil felt heavier and his heart restless. The woman, whom the townsfolk called the Apache, remained quiet. She helped with chores not out of obedience, but as though fulfilling some inner vow. There was purpose in her every movement, in the way she carried water, in the way she watched the desert beyond the fences, as though waiting for a sign that only she could see. At night, Elias sometimes heard her rise from her corner of the small cabin and step outside. Through the window he saw her silhouette under the pale light of the moon, her face turned toward the distant mountains. She seemed to belong to that vast land in a way he never could. It stirred something in him. Guilt, perhaps, or admiration, or both. He had thought he'd won fortune, yet what he'd received was a mirror reflecting his own smallness against the grand cruelty of the frontier. The town grew colder toward him. Men spat his name in the saloon. Women crossed the street when he passed. The preacher muttered that no man should keep the company of the heathen tribes. Even those who once shared whiskey with him now avoided his shadow. They feared that trouble would follow, and in their fear they weren't entirely wrong. One dawn, Elias awoke to find tracks near the edge of his property. Hoofprints and bare footprints that hadn't been there before. The Apache woman had been outside again that night, and her gaze seemed more distant than ever. When the wind blew from the north, he thought he heard faint calls echoing from the hills, carried like ghosts through the canyon. Something was approaching, slow, certain, and inevitable. The nights grew tenser. Coyotes howled closer than usual. Horses snorted in their stalls as though catching the scent of something unseen. Then, one night, a fire glimmered in the far ridge. Not a wildfire, but a controlled signal flame. The woman saw it too. Her expression did not change, but her eyes shimmered like dark glass. She understood. Her people were near. That same night, Dry Creek awoke to chaos. A ranch 2 miles west was found burning by morning. 3 men were missing, and one survivor claimed to have seen painted faces in the dark. Panic swept the town like a sickness. The colonel barked orders, forming a posse and declaring vengeance. He warned Elias that if he harbored any connection to the Apache, he'd hang for treason. But Elias only stood silent, feeling the heavy pulse of destiny tightening around him like a noose. He returned home to find the woman gone. The door was open, the wind whispering through the cabin's empty space. The tracks led toward the canyon trail. He saddled his horse and followed, though he did not know why, whether it was to save her or to beg her forgiveness. The trail was long and treacherous, winding through rocks that caught the moonlight like shards of glass. By the time he found her, dawn was breaking. She stood on a high ridge, her silhouette framed by the red glow of sunrise. Below, a small group of riders waited. Apache warriors, their horses restless, their spears glinting in the light. Elias stopped at a distance. The woman turned, her gaze steady. Between them lay silence thicker than any words could fill. In that stillness, Elias understood that she had never been his to keep, yet fate had its own cruel rhythm. From behind, the sound of hooves shattered the calm. The colonel's posse had followed, rifles in hand, eyes burning with vengeance. Gunfire cracked across the canyon before Elias could shout a warning. Dust erupted, horses screamed, and the air filled with chaos. The Apache riders scattered, returning fire from the ridges. The woman fell to her knees, torn between two worlds, one of blood and another of sorrow. Elias spurred his horse forward, his mind a blur of fear and guilt. He reached her through the smoke and dust, dismounting as bullets split the air around them. She was unharmed but frozen, staring at the destruction she had neither wanted nor caused. The colonel's men closed in, shouting orders, their hate rising like wildfire. Elias grabbed her arm, urging her toward the canyon path. Behind them, the colonel raised his rifle, his face pale with fury. The next sound was deafening. A single shot echoed through the desert, bouncing off the cliffs and dying in the wind. When the smoke cleared, the colonel's horse reared, throwing him to the ground. One of the Apache warriors had taken the shot from above. A perfect strike. Panic spread among the posse, and they fled back toward Dry Creek. The battle was over almost as soon as it began, leaving behind silence, smoke, and the faint smell of gunpowder. Elias stood beside the woman, breathing hard. Around them, the sun climbed over the mountains, washing the battlefield in golden light. The Apache riders watched from a distance. One of them, older with silver streaks in his hair, met the woman's gaze. In his eyes was something like recognition and sorrow. Then, with a silent nod, the riders turned and disappeared into the desert, leaving Elias and the woman alone once more. When they returned to the ranch, the land felt changed. The soil, once dry and lifeless, now seemed to pulse with the memory of what had happened. Elias could not explain it, but something between them had shifted. The woman was no longer just a captive, and he no longer a master. They were both prisoners of fate, bound by the same chain, forged not of iron, but of guilt, survival, and an unspoken truth neither could name. As night fell once more over Dry Creek, Elias knew the town would not forgive him. The colonel's men would return with anger in their hearts and vengeance in their hands. But he also knew that running was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption. And somewhere beyond the hills, the desert wind carried a promise that every man who took what was not his would one day have to pay the price. The days following the gunfire at Red Mesa passed in uneasy silence. The desert seemed to breathe differently now, slower, heavier, as though holding its breath for what was still to come. Elias Carter worked the land in solitude, his thoughts echoing with the memory of smoke and blood. The Apache woman remained by his side, quiet as ever, but her presence had changed. The distance between them no longer felt like a wall, but like a bridge made of fragile, shared pain. Word of the colonel's fall spread through Dry Creek faster than wildfire. Some called it justice, others called it murder. The town had lost its self-proclaimed leader, and fear began to rule in his place. The preacher warned of divine punishment, and the townsfolk whispered that Elias had brought an Apache curse upon them. Each rumor added weight to his name, until he became a symbol of everything they despised, the man who defied order, who sided with those they feared. At the ranch, the days grew long and the nights restless. Elias watched the horizon often, half expecting riders to appear and finish what the colonel had started, but none came. Instead, the desert remained still, its only sounds the wind brushing through dry grass and the lonely call of distant coyotes. The woman moved through this silence with a grace that unsettled him, a rhythm in her steps, a quiet strength that seemed to calm even the restless horses. Elias began to notice small things. She tended the earth behind the cabin, where he thought nothing could grow. Each morning she watered a patch of soil, her movements patient and deliberate. Soon, small green shoots began to rise, fragile but alive. It was a strange miracle in a place where even hope struggled to breathe. He did not ask what she planted, he simply watched, learning something unspoken about endurance. Yet peace in the west was never meant to last. One evening, as the sun sank into a red haze, the first rider appeared on the ridge, a scout wearing a black hat and carrying a rifle slung low. Elias saw him from the porch and knew what it meant. The law was coming, and with it, vengeance. By dawn, smoke rose from the town again, this time not from battle but from preparation. Men were gathering, arming themselves. The new sheriff, appointed by the colonel's brother, had sworn to cleanse Dry Creek of the Apache stain. Elias understood that they would come for her, and for him too for daring to protect her. The desert grew tense. Even the wind felt sharp. The woman sensed it as well. She moved more cautiously, her eyes scanning the ridges at dusk, her hand never far from the knife she had taken from one of the fallen soldiers weeks before. Elias wanted to believe they could remain hidden, that the world would forget them, but he knew better. The West did not forgive. It only waited for the right moment to collect its debts. On the third night, thunder rolled across the plains, though no storm followed. It was the sound of hooves, heavy, relentless, drawing closer. The posse had come. A dozen men rode hard through the darkness, torches flickering like serpents' tongues. They surrounded the ranch with the quiet cruelty of hunters who already smelled blood. Elias's horse neighed in fear. The woman stood at the doorway, her face carved from shadow. The world seemed to hold its breath again, suspended between firelight and silence. Then, without warning, the first torch hit the cabin wall. Flames crawled up the dry wood, snapping and spitting. Elias grabbed the bucket from the well, but it was useless. The fire moved too fast, hungry for destruction. They fled through the back, racing into the open desert. Behind them the cabin that had once sheltered them burned to ashes, its glow a cruel beacon under the night sky. The posse shouted, their voices fading and rising as they searched the darkness. The desert became their only refuge now. Vast, empty, merciless. The moon hung low and bright, guiding them across dry riverbeds and canyons etched deep into the land. Hours passed before they found shelter, a narrow cave hidden beneath a ridge of red stone. Inside, the air was cool and still. Elias collapsed from exhaustion, his body trembling, his hands blistered from the rains. The woman knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and wrapped his hand, her movements steady, deliberate. It was the first time she had touched him without fear. For the first time Elias felt something shift deep inside, a warmth born not from desire but from understanding. They were no longer master and slave, nor captor and captive. They were survivors, bound together by fire and fate. When morning came, the desert stretched before them like an ocean of silence. The posse was still out there, combing the land. Elias knew they couldn't outrun them forever. He also knew that turning her in might save his own life. But that thought felt like a betrayal of everything he had come to believe. He had taken part in her captivity, whether by choice or by chance, and now he bore the burden of undoing it. For days, they wandered deeper into the wilderness. Hunger gnawed at them, water grew scarce. Yet, amid the hardship, there was a strange peace, the kind that only comes when a man accepts his place in the story fate has written for him. The woman walked ahead, guiding them by instinct. She knew the land better than he ever could. Her silence was no longer distant, it was purposeful, like a prayer whispered to the earth itself. One night, as they rested beneath a sky full of stars, Elias looked around and realized they were standing on sacred ground, ancient stones carved with markings half swallowed by time. The woman knelt beside one of them, pressing her hand against its surface. The moment felt timeless, as if the desert itself had paused to remember. Elias finally understood that this was not just her home, it was her world, and though he had stumbled into it by chance, it had changed him beyond measure. But far beyond the horizon, Dry Creek still burned with vengeance. The new sheriff had sworn that by the next moon he would bring back the runaway property, dead or alive. The hunt was far from over, and in the quiet of that sacred canyon, where stars flickered like old spirits, Elias Carter realized the price of redemption was only beginning to be paid. The sun rose over the wastelands like a blade, cutting through the last shreds of night. Elias Carter and the Apache woman moved through a world painted in red and gold, the endless desert that stretched beyond the known map of men. The wind carried no mercy, only dust and silence. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself sought to pull them down into its ancient bones. Their flight had stripped them of everything: home, safety, belonging. What remained was instinct and the faint thread of trust that had grown between them. The woman walked ahead, her pace steady despite the exhaustion that clung to them both. Elias followed, his mind clouded with guilt and questions. He had thought fortune would free him from hardship, but instead it had chained him to a destiny he could never have imagined. Each night, they rested beneath the stars. The desert sky held more light than darkness, but it was a cold light, the kind that showed every scar on the land. They shared what little water they had, rationing it drop by drop. The woman gathered roots and herbs, whispering prayers to the earth before taking what it offered. Elias didn't understand her rituals, yet something in them felt sacred, older than the world he knew. One night, as the fire flickered low, Elias watched her trace patterns in the sand, symbols, circles, and lines, stories told in silence. The flames caught her eyes, reflecting a depth that words could never reach. He began to see her not as a captive, but as the living spirit of the desert itself, fierce, enduring, untamed. In her silence was strength, in her every movement, grace. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rhythm of their journey. They crossed dried riverbeds, climbed jagged ridges, and walked valleys that whispered of ancient wars long forgotten. The woman knew every contour of the land, where to find hidden springs, where to shelter from sandstorms. Elias learned by watching her. Slowly he began to understand the desert's language, the tilt of a raven's flight, the shimmer of heat that warned of mirage, the whisper of wind that foretold danger. But peace is a fragile thing in the West. It never lasts long enough to be trusted. One afternoon, as they descended into a canyon of red stone, Elias spotted movement on the ridge above, distant silhouettes glinting in the sunlight, riders. He counted at least 5, moving slow and deliberate. The sheriff's men had found their trail. They pressed on, quickening their pace. The canyon narrowed until it became a corridor of shadow and stone. The woman stopped suddenly, her hand resting against the rock wall. She turned her face upward, eyes scanning the cliffside. Then she led him to a small crevice, barely wide enough for 2. Inside the air was cool, the light dim. They waited there, pressed close as the sound of hoofbeats echoed above them like thunder. The riders passed, their torches casting brief flashes across the rock. One man dismounted, examining the tracks below. For a moment Elias thought they had been discovered, but after a tense pause the riders moved on, their voices fading with distance. When silence returned, Elias exhaled, his heartbeat still drumming in his ears. The woman leaned against the wall, her expression calm but her breathing sharp. In that narrow space, surrounded by the living heart of the canyon, something changed. For the first time, Elias reached out, not in command, not in fear, but in understanding. And though no words were spoken, the moment carried the weight of forgiveness. The following days blurred into a quiet struggle for survival. The desert grew harsher, its heat crueler. Their supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Yet amid the hardship, a strange serenity began to take hold. Elias no longer thought of the lottery, nor of the riches he'd once dreamed of. His world had been stripped down to the essentials, the sound of the woman's footsteps, the endless breath of the desert wind, and the faint hope that somewhere ahead lay freedom. One morning, the woman led him to a place unlike any other, a hidden oasis, concealed behind a wall of stone and brush. Water glimmered like glass, surrounded by wildflowers and palm-like trees. It felt like stepping into a dream untouched by time. Here, for the first time since their flight began, they rested without fear. Elias bathed in the cool water, washing away layers of dust and blood. The woman stood at the edge of the pool, her reflection rippling with the wind. For a moment he imagined what life might have been, had fate been kinder. A small home by the water, no chains, no fear, only peace. But peace in the Wild West was a fleeting ghost, and even as he thought it, he knew it would not last. That night, the sky burned with stars. The air was warm, the silence deep. They sat beside the fire, the woman weaving strands of dry grass into shapes Elias didn't recognize, perhaps charms for protection, or prayers to unseen spirits. Her face softened in the glow, her eyes no longer filled with distance but with quiet acceptance. Elias realized that love, in this barren world, did not need words. It was not declared, it was endured, It was the act of staying when the world demanded you run, of protecting another even when it meant losing everything. And though he could never undo what had been done, he could choose what came next. But fate had not finished its cruel game. At dawn, the silence shattered, a gunshot echoing across the canyon. The birds fled the trees, and the oasis rippled with chaos. Elias ran toward the ridge, his heart pounding. On the horizon, he saw dust rising, a line of riders cutting through the desert like a dark wave. The sheriff's men had found them again, and this time they would not be denied. The woman stood by the water's edge, her eyes fixed on the approaching storm. There was no fear in her gaze, only resolve. She turned, retrieving a bow carved from desert wood, hidden among the rocks. Elias realized with a chill that she had always known this moment would come. The desert had given them sanctuary. Now it demanded a price. As the first riders appeared over the dunes, the woman drew her bow. Elias reached for his rifle, feeling the old weight of destiny settle on his shoulders once more. The sun broke over the ridge, turning the oasis into a mirror of fire and gold. The desert's blood was about to be spilled again. The desert dawn was painted in shades of crimson and gold, the color of blood and fate. The air trembled with the rhythm of approaching hooves. Dust rose in the distance, spiraling like ghosts. The sheriff's men were closing in, and the quiet sanctuary of the oasis had become a battlefield waiting to ignite. Elias Carter stood at the water's edge, rifle in hand, feeling the weight of every choice that had led him here. Beside him, the Apache woman stood motionless, her bow drawn, her dark hair flowing like a banner in the hot wind. Her eyes reflected the light of the rising sun, fierce and unyielding. She was no longer the slave the colonel had paraded before the crowd in Dry Creek. She was a warrior, the living echo of a people the desert refused to forget. The riders came fast, cutting through the dunes with torches and rifles. The sheriff led them, his face a pale scar of rage beneath his hat. Behind him rode men hardened by hate, men who believed they were bringing order back to the frontier. To them, Elias was a traitor, and the woman beside him an enemy to be erased. The first bullet cracked through the air, striking the rocks near the water. The sound rolled across the canyon like thunder. Elias ducked behind a fallen log, returning fire. Dust and smoke filled the air. The woman loosed an arrow that struck one of the riders cleanly, sending him tumbling from his horse. The fight had begun, wild and merciless, the desert itself echoing their fury. The oasis became a storm of fire and echoes. Horses screamed, rifles thundered, and arrows hissed like serpents through the air. Elias fought not for glory, not for vengeance, but for survival, for her. Each shot he fired was an oath to the life they had built, brief though it was. The woman moved like wind and flame, her arrows finding their mark with unerring precision. But there were too many. The posse spread wide, surrounding them. Torches arced through the air, landing among the dry brush. Flames leapt upward, consuming the oasis that had sheltered them. The water reflected fire now, turning the once peaceful pool into a mirror of ruin. Smoke filled the air, stinging their eyes, choking their breath. The woman signaled toward the rocks, a hidden trail that led deeper into the canyons. Elias nodded, understanding. They moved together, retreating through the narrow pass as the fire raged behind them. Every step was a struggle through smoke and ash, the world burning around them like a vision of hell. At the edge of the canyon, they paused. The path ahead led to higher ground, open ridges where the desert stretched endlessly beyond. But the riders were close, behind, their shouts echoing through the gorge. Elias turned, his rifle low on ammunition, his heart beating like a drum of war. He knew the truth then. They would not both make it out alive. The woman seemed to sense it too. She stopped, placing her hand briefly against the stone wall, her gaze soft yet resolute. In that moment, Elias understood what she intended, not with words, but with the stillness in her eyes. She would not run. She would fight to give him a chance to escape. But Elias had already made his choice long before this day. He would not abandon her. Whatever destiny the desert had written, they would meet it together. The riders poured into the canyon, firing wildly. Bullets struck the stone, sending shards flying. Elias took cover behind a boulder, returning fire until the rifle clicked empty. He grabbed the fallen weapon of a dead outlaw and kept shooting. The woman moved beside him, releasing arrow after arrow until her quiver was bare. Still they came, relentless, faceless, consumed by vengeance. When the ammunition was gone, silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of distant fire and the groan of the wind. The sheriff's voice rose above it, shouting orders, promising no mercy. The desert around them shimmered with heat and death. Then, from the ridge above, came a sound like the cry of eagles. Elias looked up, and for a heartbeat, he thought the desert itself had come alive. Figures appeared on the high ground, riders, painted in red and black, their silhouettes fierce against the blazing sky. Apache warriors. They descended like the storm, their arrows raining down with deadly precision. The sheriff's men broke ranks, chaos erupting in the canyon. Horses reared, men screamed, and the tide of battle turned in an instant. The woman stood tall, her expression unreadable as her people swept down to reclaim what had been stolen. Elias staggered to his feet, his strength nearly gone. He watched as the Apache drove the posse back, their battle cries rising with the wind. The sheriff fell from his horse, clutching his chest, the life draining from his eyes. Smoke drifted across the canyon, carrying with it the bitter scent of victory and loss. When the fighting ended, the desert was silent once more. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the fallen. Elias stood among the wreckage, his hands shaking, his chest burning with exhaustion. The Apache woman walked toward him, her steps slow, her eyes distant. Around them, her people gathered the wounded and tended to their fallen. She turned to Elias, and though no words were spoken, the meaning was clear. The bond between them, forged in fire, blood, and mercy, had reached its final test. Her people had come for her, and with them came freedom. But for Elias, that freedom meant loss. He could not follow where she was going. The desert had claimed her once, and now it was taking her back. As the Apache prepared to leave, Elias stood at the edge of the canyon, watching her silhouette fade into the setting sun. The wind carried the faint echo of her footsteps, mingling with the dying embers of the fire. In his heart he felt both emptiness and peace, the strange, hollow kind that follows a man who has finally done the right thing, no matter the cost. The desert grew quiet again, vast and eternal, swallowing the sounds of war and sorrow. The last light of day shimmered on the water below, reflecting the sky's dying fire. Elias turned away, his figure small against the endless horizon. He had once thought fortune would change his life. Instead, fate had stripped him bare, revealing what truly mattered beneath the dust and greed. He had found redemption not in gold, but in sacrifice. And yet, even as he walked alone into the desert's heart, he knew her spirit would never leave him. She had become part of the land, the whisper in the wind, the pulse in the earth, the unending rhythm of the wild frontier. But destiny in the Wild West has a way of circling back. The desert does not forget those who bled upon its sands. And for Elias Carter, one final reckoning still waited beyond the next horizon. The desert was still, blanketed in a pale mist that rose from the canyon like breath from the earth itself. Dawn came slow and heavy that morning, dragging its light across the scorched land where fire and blood had mingled just days before. The echoes of battle had faded, but the ghosts of it lingered in every whisper of wind. Elias Carter rode alone, his horse weary, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The smell of gunpowder and smoke still clung to him like a shadow that refused to leave. Behind him lay the ashes of everything he had once known, the town of Dry Creek, the men who had hunted him, the life he had thought he wanted. Ahead stretched only the open horizon, vast and merciless. The gold ticket that had once promised fortune was long gone, lost somewhere in the chaos. It no longer mattered. The promise of wealth had brought him nothing but pain, forcing him to reckon with the truth of who he was and what he had done. But even in his loneliness, her memory lived within him. The Apache woman's image followed him like a spirit, her eyes bright as firelight, her presence both strength and ache. He remembered the last moment he saw her, standing among her people as the sun bled across the rocks. She had turned once, her gaze finding his in the dying light, and though no words passed between them, everything was said. In her silence, there had been forgiveness, and something more eternal. Elias now wandered the barren lands with no destination, only purpose. He sought atonement, perhaps even peace, though he doubted either could be found in a world so cruel and vast. The desert had a way of stripping a man bare, leaving only what was real beneath the dust and scars. Days turned into weeks. He passed through ghost towns and broken ranches, the skeletons of dreams long since buried under the sun. Once he found shelter in an abandoned mission where the walls still bore faint traces of hymns and prayers. He slept there beneath the cracked altar, and in his dreams he saw her face again, the Apache woman, smiling faintly, her hair stirring in a desert wind that never ceased. Each morning he woke to the same emptiness, the same ache that could not be soothed. Yet somehow he kept moving. Something within him, perhaps the part of him she had touched, refused to give up. He began to leave water and food in hidden places along the trails, gifts for travelers or tribes that might pass through. It was his way of giving back to a land that had taken so much. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky burned red, Elias came across an old man sitting beside a small campfire near the edge of a dry riverbed. The man's skin was weathered, his hair silver and braided with strips of leather. Around his neck hung a small medallion engraved with Apache markings. Elias approached slowly, unsure if he was welcome, but the old man nodded once, as though he had been expecting him. They sat in silence by the fire, the flames painting their faces in flickering gold. No words were exchanged, but Elias felt a strange calm settle over him. When morning came, the old man was gone. In his place, resting upon a stone near the ashes of the fire, lay a single feather, black and red, the colors of the Apache war banners. Elias took it in his hand, understanding its meaning without needing to hear it spoken. It was a sign, a blessing, perhaps even forgiveness from the spirits of her people. With renewed strength, he turned his horse toward the mountains. The path was steep and narrow, winding through canyons carved by centuries of wind and rain. Higher he climbed, until the desert stretched below like an ocean of fire and dust. The wind grew colder, sharper, as if whispering the secrets of those who had walked these lands before. At the summit, Elias dismounted. Before him spread the vast emptiness of the frontier, endless ridges, golden plains, and the distant shimmer of the horizon where earth met sky. He removed his hat and stood in silence. From his pocket he pulled a small silver locket, something he had carried since the night of the battle. Inside it, wrapped in worn cloth, was a strand of her dark hair, tied with a red thread. He opened the locket one last time, holding it against the wind. The strand fluttered free, carried off into the sky, dancing in the sunlight, until it disappeared into the distance. For a long time Elias stood there, feeling the desert's breath against his skin. He thought of how it had all begun, the foolish hope of gold, the cruel lottery that had delivered him not riches, but a life he never expected. What he had won was not money or power. It was something far rarer, the chance to see beyond himself, to understand the price of freedom and the weight of compassion. The wind shifted then, warm and gentle, carrying with it a faint echo, the sound of laughter, soft and distant. It was her, or maybe just the memory of her. Either way, it was enough. Elias smiled for the first time in many months. He turned back toward his horse, mounting slowly, his body weary but his spirit lighter. He rode west, chasing the sun as it climbed once more into the sky. The desert stretched endlessly before him, harsh, unforgiving, and yet beautiful in its vastness. Some say Elias Carter was later seen working as a guide for passing settlers, leading them safely through Apache lands where few dared to tread. Others say he disappeared entirely, swallowed by the desert like so many before him. But the tribes still tell a story of a pale-skinned man who rode under their protection, a man who carried an Apache feather, and spoke of a woman with fire in her soul. They say that when the sun sets red over the western hills, his spirit rides beside hers, two silhouettes against the horizon, forever bound by the land that made them and the love that redeemed them both. And as the stars bloom each night over the desert's quiet heart, the wind still whispers their story, of greed turned to grace, of chains turned to freedom, and of a man who thought he had won fortune, but instead found something far greater. For in the end, the true wealth of a man lies not in gold or luck, but but in the hearts he touches, and the love that outlives him. The last light of day faded, leaving the sky awash with silver and shadow. The desert grew still once more. The story of Elias Carter had come full circle, written not in ink, but in sand and fire, forever a part of the wild, eternal West.